Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So let's start. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us
For
this interview.
Please tell us something about your early years. How did you come to philosophy?
I was always interested in big metaphysical questions. The traditional questions, space and time, free will, mind and body, meaning, all of them, but I was also interested in religion and had always been a religious person, and it seemed to me that when I was young, religious people didn't have very much by way of defense against modern secularism. They couldn't say why they believed that there was a God, or why that made any difference to human life, or why the commands of God would make a difference to what we ought to do. And I thought the techniques of modern philosophy, which I was learning, might be useful in analyzing and, if it were to seem that way, justifying religious belief. And that's been a primary interest of mine, the primary interest of mine in my philosophical work, but I've also written on and been interested in other branches of philosophy, including what you wish to talk about, mind and body. Yes.
Yes. You told us about analysis, analytic philosophy. What is it, analytic philosophy for you? Which were the most important achievements in analytic philosophy in the last 50 years?
Yes, I think the name is a bit of a misnomer these days, but when, as it were, Anglo-American philosophy started up again in the 1930s, influenced in particular by the Vienna Circle, developing into logical positivism and then into logical analysis, it really was analysis. That is to say, the Vienna Circle thought that if you it was necessary to analyze the meaning of statements, because if they could be verified they were meaningful, and if they couldn't be verified they were not meaningful, and the task of philosophy was to show which statements, if any, were meaningful. This was an analysis of words, and what later was called linguistic analysis was really a more subtle form of this. J.L. Austin and above all Wittgenstein were concerned with many traditional metaphysical doctrines of the past arose from misunderstanding the meaning of words, and if we really knew what the word mean, what the word know, K-N-O-W, the word know means, then we wouldn't have a real problem about knowledge, because we could see what it meant to say that somebody knew something. We could analyze the difference between knowledge and belief, and when we had analyzed that, there wouldn't be any big problem about how people could know anything, because if one such analysis was to know something was to have a justified belief in it and for it to be true. So we could see if somebody knew something by seeing if they had a justified belief in the proposition and whether the proposition was true, and that would show whether or not they didn't know anything. So there wouldn't be any problem of knowledge left. This attitude to the metaphysical questions of the past seemed to me a little cavalier, and has seemed to most philosophers in the Anglo-American tradition since the 1970s also to be what I call cavalier, in other words, very supercilious and not really seeing what was at issue in the big problems of the past. So Anglo-American philosophy developed in the 1970s, certainly starting with a careful analysis of the concepts we're dealing with, but also to ask the big metaphysical questions of the past, but to ask them in a rigorous, careful way, and especially being sensitive to the latest discoveries of modern science. That is what has characterized analytic philosophy since the 1970s. Rigor, careful use of words, sensitivity to modern science, and in a sense starting from the empiricist tradition that we must be sensitive to the deliverances of experience as well as what modern science has made of them, the tradition of Locke, Berkeley and Hume. Well, there's a continuity between logical positivism, logical analysis, philosophies, which is done in the Anglo-American world today. But I think it's a bit of a misnomer to call the sort of philosophy done in the Anglo-American world today analytic philosophy, because most philosophers are not concerned with analysing anything. They are concerned with building a big metaphysical picture saying what things exist and how they interact. And that's great, but it's not analysis.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. What do you think about the current state of the philosophy of mind?
Well, it seems to change very quickly. So I'm not certain about what the current state is. But there was, if we start with perhaps the 1980s, there was a very strong movement to believe that talk about the mental life really could be reduced to, not necessarily analysed in terms of, but reduced to talk about the physical. Behaviourism had been fashionable in the 1940s and 50s, and Gilbert Ryle's book, The Concept of Mind, was really, though he denied it, a behaviourist work. That is to say that talk about the mental was talk about public behaviour. But then as people became more sensitive to science, they thought that perhaps talk about the mental was really talk about the brain, what was going on in the brain. And mind-brain identity theory started in the late 50s and early 60s in a crude way, which has been developed very subtly over many years. But I should have thought probably still the majority of philosophers of mind are physicalists, but only a small minority. It would have been quite a large minority 20 years ago, perhaps. And the other, not equally fashionable, but not unacceptable position is what is called property dualism or event dualism. That is that talk about the mental must include talk about people's pains and sensory data, and perhaps also their beliefs and intentions and desires, and these are properties of a person in virtue of being properties of his brain on this account. And so people have two sorts of properties: the physical ones, the publicly accessible ones, and the mental ones, the privately accessible ones. No doubt evidenced by public behaviour and brain goings on, but still something which is evidenced by them and is best known to the subject. There are all sorts of variants of this. Some philosophers are only prepared to admit the sensory properties as truly mental. That is to say, qualia, as they are sometimes called. They're prepared to say that sensations and patterns of colour in your visual field and noises are not physical things, but are produced by physical things. But other philosophers are prepared to admit that even beliefs, one's belief that today is Monday, or purposes, my intention of going back to the university, or my desire for a cup of tea, these are also mental things, not fully analysable in terms either of public behaviour or of goings on in the brain. I think that's right so far, but I'm afraid that I am an extremist in the other direction, and that I believe not merely that there are mental properties of this sort, but that they are properties of a mental subject. That is to say that there are, in my view, there are two parts to the human person on earth: his body and his soul, and these are separate parts, and mental properties belong to the soul belong to the person in virtue of belonging to the person's soul, and physical properties belong to the person in virtue of belonging to the person's body. This view is called substance dualism. And Plato was a substance dualist, Descartes was a substance dualist, and various other philosophers in the history of philosophy have been substance dualists, and this is regarded as a highly unjustified view. I think it's true, and I think that philosophers are simply insensitive to the arguments in favour of it.
But you just said that you vindicate a kind of substance dualism. But can you say a few words about differences that exist between your dualism and Cartesian dualism?
There aren't many differences. I would disagree with Descartes about one or 2 points. I mean, Descartes is usually thought to have said that animals are not conscious and therefore don't have souls, and I think all the evidence is that animals are conscious, and for that reason I want to say they do have souls. But I can't think of anything else I would have disagreed with Descartes about.
Only this disagreement?
Well, I mean, you suggest something else to me off the cuff. I can't think of anything that I would disagree with. And I mean, clearly his physiology was crazy and out of date, but I mean, and the thought that the mind interacted with the body and the pineal gland is ill-justified. I mean, exactly what part of the brain causes the mental events or is caused by them is still a matter of physiological controversy. But I go for the view that it is the cerebral cortex that is the main vehicle of interaction.
It seems that most contemporary philosophers believe that mind-body problem is something that can be solved, so that to say, in a one step. But maybe the mind-body problem is rather a collection of problems, so it can be solved only gradually. What do you think? How would you define the mind-body problem? And is it possible to solve this problem in a one step?
Well, the central problem is how is the mental life, and that is primarily the conscious life, but also the intentional life, that is to say, our beliefs, desires, purposes are intentional events in that they consist in an attitude to things. Under description, you believe that today is Monday, that is a cup of tea. Intentions are intentions to do something under a certain description. I intend to go back to the university and so on. But I think what unifies the mental is the privacy of access. That is to say, whatever anyone else can find out about my sensations or about my beliefs, by studying my behavior or by studying my brain, I could find out by the same route. But I have a way of knowing about these things which is not open to other people, because I experience them, I'm aware of them. And the central mind-body problem is the relation of the mental life to the physical, what goes on in the brain and consequently in the body. And the first problem is to see that is a problem, that there is a causal relation here between two sorts of events, because as the views which we've just been discussing earlier suggest that this is, or the physicalist wants to deny that there is a causal relation between two different kinds of events. Physical, the property dualist allows that there is. And the first problem is to analyze what's happening. I take the view that there is a relation between two sorts of events, and the next problem is, what do these events consist in? Do they consist in the instantiation of the properties in a separate substance or soul, or do they consist in the instantiation of the properties in the brain? The first problem is to analyze, and I think in this case it is a matter of analysing the data, to face up to the data. My criticism of both the physicalist and of the property dualist is they don't face up to the data because they're so scared of what it might lead to. And the second problem is to explain how it is that the brain causes existence of cells, or where cells come from, or causes this, that and the other to be instantiated in my brain. If my analysis of the situation is right, there is not going to be a scientific explanation of this, though I could be wrong about that, and it wouldn't be important for me if I was wrong about this, but I think I'm right about this. That is to say, I don't think that you can expand physics to bring in laws of interactions as to why a certain state of a brain leads to consciousness and another state does not, and why a certain state of the brain produces a green image and another one produces a red image, and so on. I just think science has got to face it. There are just large lots of connections which can't be unified in the scientific theory. But I could be wrong about that, but I think that's the way I see the situation at the moment. Certainly a physicalist doesn't like that and wants to have a theory that will explain these things, and good luck to him. I'm not averse to that, because even if you could explain these things, what I would insist on is the things to be explained are causal relations between different kinds of events, and the things to be explained in the mental case are the thing that there is a soul which has these properties. And there are periphery problems round that of the mind-body problem, the difference between the passive events, the sensations happen to you, and the active events, agency, the things you do, and analysing what these consist in, and going on to the now closely connected issue of the freedom of the will, that is to say, the extent to which human intentions are caused by either earlier mental states or earlier brain states. It is exciting the way that science has been coming into the picture here.
So the problem of the freedom of the will is a part of the mind-body problem.
I think it is. The solution is liable to require that, yes. But when you say the freedom of the will, that term can be defined in various ways. It's a philosopher's term, freedom of the will. Why people are interested in the freedom of the will is because they are interested in what makes us, or whether we are morally responsible for our actions, and they, as it were, think we are if we do these things, and therefore they say people have free will if they have the sort of will which will lead them to be morally responsible. But of course, for some philosophers, you're morally responsible even though your acts are caused, and for other philosophers, the non-causing of actions is necessary, though perhaps not sufficient for free will. But if you understand by the freedom of the will our actions not being caused by previous states of affairs, then certainly to get the answer to that, you need an account of intentions and to get and whether they're caused, and that brings you all into the main area of the mind-body problem. Yes.
But can we prove that we have free will?
In this sense?
Yes, in this sense.
It's a problem I'm very currently interested in and working on. To some extent we are at the mercy of science here, but what the philosopher can do perhaps is to show that science couldn't show certain sorts of things, it could show other sorts of things. I mean, some scientists have tried to show, or no doubt familiar with the recent neurophysiology literature, tried to show that our intentions don't make any difference at all to our actions, they're just caused by brain state. Now I think the philosopher can come along here and say this program is doomed to failure because you couldn't know about your intentions unless anybody else's intentions, unless they had an effect on their brain which would lead to which would immediately deny what people are trying to prove, is that intentions don't cause brain events. If that was true, you couldn't learn about the intentions, and so you couldn't learn whether or not the intentions cause brain events. So I think that's as it were something a philosopher can weigh on to the more interesting and substantial question is whether our intentions are caused by previous brain states or mental states. And I think scientific discoveries will be crucial to this, but a philosopher can say why he thinks or doesn't think that they're likely to have a certain result. And I'm inclined to think that because of the complexity of the relations between mind and body, which we briefly talked about, it's simply not going to be possible to predict human actions. The reason for saying that is what science is beginning to show, and surely correctly, is that there's no one-to-one correlation between the thought that this is a cup of tea, and there's no, as it were, two brain neurons which will have to fire to give you that thought. It would be, the correlations would not be between individual neurons firing and individual mental states. They would be between large numbers of neurons firing, what psychologists now call the global workspace, and large numbers of mental events simultaneous. And every slight change at the brain state is going to lead to a change at the mental state, but there's no one-to-one rule which will tell you what it will be. So for that reason, I'm inclined to think that science simply isn't going to do more than establish 1 trillion correlations between brain state overall and mental state overall, as a result of which it will not be able to predict when you're in a new brain state what your mental life will be, because nobody's ever been in that brain state before, and there aren't any sort of generalizations that you can make from previous states. Now, I could be wrong about that, but I think that's the way I'm trying to think probably it will go, and I think psychologists ought to be aware of the difficulties of attempting to find anything else.
Mm-hmm. But can you explain, why do you believe, as you say in your book, The Evolution of the Soul, that mind-body interaction gives evidence for existence of God?
Oh, that's an entirely different matter. I should emphasize before I answer that question that my reasons for believing in the soul and mind-body interaction are entirely of a non-religious character. But having got there, the question is whether this has any relevance to religion. I think it does have great relevance to religion in many ways. Firstly, starting at the other end, free will. Certainly the Christian religion has been, not all religions are keen on this, but the Christian religion in its majority tradition has thought it very important that humans have free will and that they are morally responsible for their actions. One can't make any sense of God punishing people for their actions if they're not responsible for them, or urging them to do anything if it's not up to them to do it. I mean, Christianity lays a great stress on humans having choices and being responsible for their actions, at least in its Catholic and above all Orthodox side. The Protestants have not always espoused that. And secondly, life after death is crucial for Christianity and indeed for most forms of theism. Well, of course, you can have life after death of an embodied sort, and Christianity does believe in that sort of life after death. But the question is, what would constitute me being risen from the dead again? Suppose I die and my body is possibly even burnt in the crematorium, as is common in the West, and the ashes are scattered to the four winds. Now, what would constitute a future person being me? If substance dualism is correct, there's absolutely no problem there. The future person being me would be my soul being united with a new body, which might consist of bits of the old body or might not. But if property dualism or physicalism are true, then what would what would constitute a future person, embodied person, being me? Well, it would have to have some of the stuff of which I was made. And there wouldn't be any stuff left for me to be made of if it's all been turned into energy. So it's not easy to see how any future person could be me. Of course, a future person could resemble me by having a similar appearance and similar memories and so on, but then a million people could resemble me by having future in their appearance and memories, and what would make one of them me? It's not obvious that there's any way of discriminating between future person being me and future person not being me unless substance dualism is correct.
So, you believe that human beings have souls. But would it be correct to interpret your main argument for existence of soul in this way? If we talk only about brain and mental events connected with it, the statements about what would happen with our person after, say, radical brain surgery, like removing half of the brain, these statements would have no sense. But surely our statements about future of our persons don't seem to be senseless. If so, there should be something else in ours, in addition to the brain and mental states. And this something, soul, gives sense to our talk about future of our persons in the case of, say, radical brain surgery. Is this a correct interpretation of your argument? Yes?
It's one important strand of my arguments. Yes.
But look, it seems that in many cases we can be quite sure what would happen to our person even if we don't talk about soul. For example, we have some evidence that our person, which is tightly connected with our linguistic abilities, so our person is typically localized in the left hemisphere. And so if, for example, we remove the right hemisphere, our person will be intact. In such a case, a statement about the future of our person seems to have a clear sense after all, even without soul.
If you think that, then consider a different sort of brain experiment where you remove half of a left hemisphere and join it to half of the left hemisphere of my twin. If you think it's the left hemisphere that is the source of the mental life, then the same problem arises in a new form. Doesn't matter really where you split the brain, though of course it's a lot easier to split the brain there.
But so
there are always going to be, wherever different people will have different views about, if you consider a whole spectrum from a totally intact brain to a brain where there's a small bit removed, a bit larger bit removed, and so on until you get to a totally new brain. Different people will make different judgments about where it's obvious it's the same person or obvious it isn't the same person. Sure. But for any person who makes such a judgment, there's going to be a border area where they say, somebody who was very keen on people having a whole brain is what's really necessary for them. Well, ask such a person, suppose I have a small brain operation and just, a tenth of my brain is removed. Is that me or not? And they too will find it a problem. Anybody's going to find it a problem, though they will find it a problem in different places.
But even if we have soul, we can be certain where our person would be.
No, we can't. I'm in no better position, but I am in a better position than this. The physicalist ought to be certain as the answer. If I say that the identity of the person consists in an individual soul, then since souls are non-physical things, I can't be expected to know where they go. But the physicalist can be expected to know where they go. That is to say, if all the truths about us were truths about the brain, we could find out where every physical part of the brain went. And if that's all there was, we should know the answer in every case. We should be able to, not perhaps today, but this is a manageable task for a future science. quite clearly, to my mind, it isn't a manageable task for a future science. And so, although I'm not in a better position to give you the answer, I am in a lot better position to explain why I can't give you the answer.
So we have started speaking about the personal identity, and one of the problems for the first, personal identity, and we've already spoken a little bit about, is branching. So, do you think that branching is possible? Let's suppose we have an advancement in the medical technology, and we split, as you mentioned, we can split one's brain and put one hemisphere into an empty skull, and perhaps the other hemisphere into another skull. So we can also add additional hardware if necessary. So there's a living body, a living human being, and a person, and conscious person in one place, and there's another one in the other place. So you suggest that one of them will be the original person, and the other one will be somebody else.
Well,
is that correct?
I suggest there are three possible answers.
Okay.
This one will be, that one won't. This one will be, that one won't, or neither.
Okay.
Neither is always a possible answer. If you messed about with the brain that much, maybe neither will be conscious. But those are the three possible answers in my view.
So you think that all three of them could be correct?
No,
Either one of them.
I mean, or indeed, if you do this experiment many times, one of them might be correct one time, one of them another time. They couldn't both be correct on a given occasion.
But why would you suggest that there would be a definite answer?
It's not even necessary, from my view, that I have to say that there would be a definite answer, because what would there not being a definite answer consist in? Well, it would be, I suppose, you would perhaps want to say, well, both of them are partly me, or something like that.
Or neither one of them.
Pardon?
Or neither one of them, or it's not clear, or it's vague.
Well, wait a minute. Neither one of them is a clear answer, and I've allowed that, and this one is, and that one isn't, is a clear answer, or this one is, and that one isn't. These are three clear answers, and I think those are the only answers, the only possible answers to what happens. Now, you are suggesting a fourth answer. If the fourth answer would be that they are both partly me. Now, I can't give any sense to that, because what would, let's call them A and B, what would A being partly me and B being partly me consist in? Well, there's no problem if me is just a physical thing, it wouldn't be having part of it. But a future me has got to, if I am to be a certain future person, I have reason to look forward to the experiences of that person if they're going to be good experiences, or to fear them if they're bad experiences. If I'm a selfish person, I have that sort of connection, which doesn't arise in the case of splitting tables or chairs or inanimate things. And I can if I am split into two, A and B, and let us say A has a marvellous life and B is tortured, what would it be for me, the same me, to be partly a person who has a marvellous life and partly a person who is tortured at the same time? It's difficult to see what this would amount to, because no one person is being tortured and having a marvellous life at the same time. No one person is even being partly tortured and having a marvellous life at the same time. For what would it be like for me to be both of those persons, since no person has any bit of each of those lives? And so for that reason I can't make much sense of it. But even if I could, it wouldn't alter the main question. That is to say, if there are four possible answers, then the problem is we don't know which of the four possible answers is correct. And this alone, a substance dualist can explain, because again, it would become for the physicalist a necessary truth, as it were, that I was both of these persons. But that seems to me highly implausible, that a necessary truth that I would be both of these persons, because it would then become a necessary truth that I would have the experiences of any person who had a part of my brain, and I can't see that as a necessary truth. I mean, if you think it is, then split them again and again and again. It becomes implausible.
You mentioned that it is hard or impossible to imagine a person at the same time being tortured and having a marvelous life. But what do you think of the personal identity disorder? These people, there are clear cases where people experience this disorder and they report in different times being different individuals. First, my question, what do you think of the multiple personality disorder? And second, what do you think, how many souls would you suggest such patients have? Is this possible that those are rare cases where there are several souls?
It is logically possible, yes, and I'm not wishing to rule that out, but I would think that in most of those cases that's not the situation at all. The situation is, it's a Freudian situation where, as it were, the same subject is unwilling to admit to himself at a certain time that he has certain kinds of beliefs and intentions, and at another time he's unwilling to admit to himself that he has the other sort of beliefs and intentions, but they're both accessible to him, as can be shown by the fact that people can be, with the help of psychiatry, forced to admit that, as it were, both of these sets of beliefs and intentions were ones that they were involved in. The typical Freudian cure is to get someone to admit their unconscious thoughts and feelings. So now, the split personality situation isn't quite that, but it's somewhat like that, in that at a certain time they are not prepared to admit certain beliefs and purposes, and conversely at another time. And the psychiatric cure would consist in getting them to recognise that at one time really both of these sets of experiences were theirs. That would, I think, be the normal explanation of these things, but I wouldn't wish to rule out on any sort of logical grounds that two souls might be in operation with one body.
Considering, we talked about the definite answer, and considering this fourth alternative where there's no definite answer, let me suggest one option.
As I described it, was that both persons were partly me.
Right.
If that's what no definite answer amounts to, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay. So, in general, you seem to be accepting the principle of evolution. In particular, you accept that human soul is the result of the evolution of life and even matter. So why wouldn't you take this principle even further and accept the analogy between the personal identity over time, or identity between person stages, and identity of species over time? So persons and their brains seem to be quite complex modular systems, where each module can function simultaneously in a quite sophisticated way. So as the species that have multiple instantiations. Now, species identity have a vague and transparent boundaries.
True.
So as personal identity, perhaps. Persons may keep identity unless some substantial functional difference arises. And species can also keep identity unless they can no longer interbreed. So why don't you accept this analogy?
Because it is an analogy and it's not a good one.
Okay.
There's a difference. If another human being suffers, I don't suffer at all. It's not merely I only suffer a bit. I don't suffer at all. On the other hand, or put it like this way, if I know that a future member of my species is going to suffer, and I am a selfish person, I don't feel anything for it. But if I know I'm going to suffer, I certainly feel a lot for it.
Mm-hmm.
there's a disanalogy. I mean, species, as you say, one could, the divisions are somewhat arbitrary between it's one species and another, traditionally on the basis of interbreeding not being possible, but you can make a division in different ways, and it's an arbitrary definition between kinds of persons, but the crucial fact about persons is we have a continuing mental life. And it's very hard to deny that, indeed. It's impossible to deny that, because an experience, any experience, lasts a time, half a second, in which case it must consist of two experiences, each of them lasting a quarter of a second, and what unites them? Well, that their experiences of the same person, and this doesn't arise with species.
So it's all, it's related to the privilege access, the special position.
That is the way I define it. I think that's what unites the mental. Some people have defined the mental in terms of the intentional, but that doesn't get at pains and after images and so on.
But let me ask you a question about this privilege access. In your book, Evolution of the Soul, you suggest that each person is in the position to have a privilege access to some knowledge, namely about the mental properties. So, is our personal identity one of the issues we know about ourselves better than anybody else?
Yes.
And is this possible, that the person doesn't know who he is, or can be mistaken about that?
Yes. By who he is, you mean whether he was the person who did so-and-so yesterday? Oh, certainly, we can all be mistaken about this. But there is a privileged access all the same. Starting with, there's a privileged access to that I exist at all. Other people might conclude from my public behaviour and so on that, or even from my brain, that I'm dead. But as we know from recent discoveries, it has been beings who were thought to be dead have now been discovered to have a conscious life. Well, this is a subsequent discovery, but the person themselves had a privileged access and continues to have a privileged access to that fact. So quite apart from anything over time, subjects have a privileged access to the fact that they exist, and that's right. And I think we have a privileged access to our immediately past mental experiences. I'm not certain whether I want to say even that we had, certainly not to our future experiences. I can't know better than anybody else what I'm going to experience in future, but I do have an access by memory of a privileged sort on the whole to immediately past experiences, but what I would think is central to the notion of privileged access as regards one's own existence is the fact one's aware of it at the moment.
Let's clarify one point, an important point, it seems to me, about existence, not existence of privileged access, but God existence. Is it really possible, what do you think, to be a substance dualist without supposing that God exists?
Oh yes, I've met various philosophers. There aren't many substance dualists, but I've certainly met substance dualists who are not theists. Yes, certainly. In my way of thinking, the existence of souls is evidence for the existence of God in a cumulative case. That is just for the reason that if there is a God, he has a reason for bringing about human beings because they're good things. And what's good about them is they can choose between good and evil, they can make a difference to the world, they can make a difference to each other. They have this great gift which God himself does not have, of choosing between good and evil. Therefore, a good God who is anxious to spread goodness would have a very good reason for bringing them about. So the fact that they're here is evidence for the existence of God, but of course not conclusive evidence. They might have turned up by some other process, but I think it's extremely unlikely. But it's certainly not incompatible with substance dualism to be an atheist. No, indeed not.
But do we have a chance to explain the interaction between body and soul if we don't accept that God exists?
Well, as I was saying earlier, I don't think we do. I don't think science is going to explain how it is that brains gave rise to the mental life and above all to souls. But, and that is a reason for invoking God at that particular stage, saying that God is responsible for the special creation of souls in each one of us. But I'm not committed to that, because it might be that God has endowed physical matter with the ability to bring forth souls at certain stages. I think it most unlikely we would discover as any extended part of physics that would say we just have to add to our laws, as it were, when brains or some other slightly complicated piece of apparatus reaches a certain stage of complexity, then there is a soul which has a mental life. That would be just an ad hoc addition to science, which it couldn't incorporate into physics. But if so, then of course God has a reason for making a science with this extra bit, rather than, as it were, interfering at a particular time. So I don't think it makes a great deal of difference how one thinks God brings about the existence of souls, whether, as it were, as an individual act of creation at particular times, or endowing physical matter with this sort of ability. But what I don't think we're going to find is that this is a natural consequence of physics. It's going to be an extra bit.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is the most powerful and dangerous objection to the substance dualism?
Yeah, but dangerous. The objections, as you know from the literature, I mean, I think they're rather weak. I mean, there's the objection, well, if it was true, we couldn't know whether some later person was the same as some earlier person. And I say, yes, but why should you expect to? Humans are not omniscient. Why should you suppose that if anything's true, we should be able to discover it's true? This seems to be an arrogance which is utterly unjustified. And then there's the objection, well, if it was true, there couldn't be an explanation of how the soul interacts with the body. Well, true, but science is always prepared to recognize that A causes B without having an explanation of how A causes B. I mean, take one example. Early in the 19th century, people realized that the motion of a magnet will produce an electric current if the wire goes around the magnet. And conversely, that an electric current will magnetize things. Okay, so here is a clear causal interaction, because we can produce the electric current by moving the magnet. Easy, clear causal interaction between two different kinds of things, very different kinds of things as far as people in the 19th century could see. But they couldn't possibly say how this occurred. But they didn't regard that as an objection to saying there's a causal interaction, and I don't think we should do so in this case. Two different kinds of things can interact, and that's just how it is. So I don't find these objections very compelling, I'm afraid. There is another objection which is a little more interesting, I think, and that is if we philosophers have since Kripke and Putnam in the early 1970s distinguished between necessities which are logical necessities and necessities of a wider kind, which they call metaphysical necessities. And the logical necessities might be discoverable, or are discoverable a priori. In other words, simply sitting down and thinking about it can convince you of simple truths of arithmetic, 5 and 7 make 12. But it is often said that there are other sorts of necessities just as strong as logical necessities, which had to be discovered by empirical investigation. The famous example might be the Hesperus and Phosphorus. The Greeks were aware of two planets, Hesperus, which or they subsequently called planets, Hesperus, which appeared in the evening star, and Phosphorus, which appeared in the morning star. Now, as a matter of fact, we know now that these are the same planet, the planet Venus, but of course they didn't know that, and so they didn't know that Hesperus is Phosphorus, but eventually they found it out. Now, the proposition Hesperus is Phosphorus, since these names pick out the same thing, couldn't but be true, given what Hesperus is, given what Phosphorus is, it couldn't but be that Hesperus is Phosphorus, right? So it might seem that there are a posteriori necessities, metaphysical necessities. Now, suppose that was true, then an objector says, and Shoemaker has made this objection, perhaps we don't quite realize what we're picking out by the name I, and if we understood things rather better, we would realize that I is really the name of my body, and when we understood that, then we would understand that substance dualism must be false. Yes, but I think that, and this is something I've written about recently, and you know about this, I think that it's important to distinguish between two kinds of words which pick out things, pick out properties or pick out substances, what I've called informative designators and what I call uninformative designators. Now, an informative designator is one such that if you understand how the word is used in the language, then you know what you're picking out. You know the essence of what you're picking out, because you can always identify a case of this, given that your faculties are operating in a normal way and that you have the concept. Now, on the other hand, there are uninformative designators, such as if you know how to use the word, you may know what it picks out on a certain occasion, but that isn't necessarily going to tell you what it picks out on another occasion. And this is because the rules for using this word are that it picks out a thing in virtue of its underlying property. That thing is the same thing as that thing if it has the same underlying properties, but you don't know what the underlying properties are. Now, give a little context to that. What makes the planet Hesperus is not the fact that it appears in the evening sky. We pick it out by the fact it appears in the evening sky, but what makes a planet that planet is being made of a certain chunk of matter, likewise with phosphorus. So we don't fully know what we're picking out by Hesperus is phosphorus, and so it's not. So the a posteriori-ness of the necessity consists in the fact that we need a posteriori investigation to understand what it is we're picking out. Once we know what it is, then a priori reasoning could show the necessary truths about it. Now, most of the words we use for picking out properties are informative designators. Brown, for example, is an informative designator. If you're rightly positioned, not subject to illusion, and so on, you can recognize whether things are brown or not, and you can recognize whether they're green or red or not, and therefore you can come to know that nothing can be red and green all over, because you fully understand what it is to be green, and you fully understand what it is to be red, and therefore you see that nothing can be both. And most of the words we use for picking out substances are uninformative designators, because for something to be the same substance as that something is a matter of having the same underlying stuff, and we don't know what the underlying stuff is, and so we may be mistaken. So there are many a posteriori necessities which arise from the use of uninformative designators, and many a priori necessities which arise from the use of informative designators. Now, what sort of designator is the word I? And I think that it's an informative designator, unlike many substance words. And the reason for that is this: it satisfies my definition. I can't be mistaken about whether something. Suppose I know that some after image is taking place. I can't be mistaken about whose after image it is. I know it's mine, or I know it's not mine. And that's that. I could be mistaken about whether the planet's Hesperus, but I could be mistaken about whether the after image is mine. So long as I am my three conditions for something being an informative designator is that I must, anyone who knows the language must be able to identify cases of its informative designator if they can recognize when it applies, so long as they're not subject to illusion, they're positioned as nearly as possible, and they understand the work. Now, if I am positioned as closely as possible, and in the case of experiences, that's always satisfied. If I'm having them, I am indeed positioned as closely as possible. And I can't be subject to illusion about whether they're mine or not. So I'm always going to be right about whether, I may use words wrongly, but given the meaning of the words, I'm always going to be right about I am in pain or I am not in pain. So that I know the essence for this reason of what I am picking out, and so I can't be picking out my body. I know what sort of thing it picks out, and therefore I think I should make the argument fails, because the word I is an informative designator, and consequently a priori reasoning can lead us to see what is necessarily true or false about it.
Some people, philosophers, say that if you are substance dualist, you multiply the entities without any necessity. But of course you believe that there is necessity. Am I right?
Yes, indeed. That is just the point. You can't describe the data without. I'll just take a different sort of example to bring this up. There's a possible world in which I don't exist, but somebody like me is talking to you. He has the same appearance, the same memories, the same life history. That is a possible world. And what that brings out is that any full description of our world has got to mention not merely that there is a person who is having certain experiences and so on, but who that is. We can give a name to the actual person, Richard Swinburne, but therefore a full description of the world will say Richard Swinburne is having such and such experiences. Now that's a datum. It's not something postulated to explain the data. It's something we start from. And if science is not prepared to start from the data and says it can't fit them in because they can't be true because it doesn't fit into our theory, I mean, this is not science.
Thank you. Can you tell us something about your current research projects and about your future books, maybe?
Well, I'm advancing in years, so the number of future books will be limited. But I am, as I mentioned earlier, working again on these particular topics, mind, body, and free will, and various other things, of course, in the past. And in particular on free will, I'm interested in this neurophysiological work that's going on, and in the logical possibility of showing or not showing that we have some kind of free will. I've been interested in big experiments, and the other experiments that neurophysiologists are doing, and I think this is very interesting stuff, but I'm interested in the philosophical issue of just what it could show and what it couldn't show, and that's fine. But it's the sort of thing I have referred to briefly in the conversation.
A lot of philosophers currently are working on a particular area, narrow questions, specialized and technical, and you have been concentrating on really big questions during your entire career. So, what do you think is is this justified? So philosophers are concerned with little technical, concrete questions, or a real philosopher has to address really big, important questions?
There's certainly scope for both. I mean, no philosopher these days can possibly work in an area without knowing what's going on in some other area and using the detailed results from some other area. Everything I've done has used results that other people have and extended them in certain sorts of directions. There's vast scope for people working on certain narrow problems, which sometimes turn out to have large consequences for big problems, and someone trying to put it all together. And yes, I have worked on some pretty large problems, that is true, and someone who does that is open to the accusation of not being sensitive to certain sorts of points, and some people have certainly tried to make that accusation against me, and sure, one must be careful, one must try to use the small points.
But one of the big questions, the question of the meaning of life, is it possible to answer this question for you?
I think it's a little bit of I'm not certain what would constitute an answer. I mean, if what we're asking for is what is a good way to live, then I can certainly give some answers to that. And if it's a question about what is the best way to live, well, there may be a number of equal best ways to live, but certainly there are good ways to live and not good ways to live. And that is obvious, really. The question of what is the meaning of life sounds mysterious. The question of is it good to live this way or that way doesn't sound at all mysterious, and can indeed be answered. And indeed, most people who do moral philosophy try and answer that question. This sorts of answers. It's not a good way to be a concentration camp guard, but it is a good way to help relieve starvation. And one can go on from there. Of course, I also think that one of the great obligations on humans is to show gratitude to their benefactors. And God is our supreme benefactor, and we owe him worship. And if he wants us to do certain things, then we owe it to him to do them. But that is an important qualification I think moral philosophy can establish certain very general principles, but given that the one I mentioned, the obligation to benefactors, is one of them, then it does have certain consequences for if insofar as there are good arguments for the existence of God, and I believe there are, it does have further good consequences which depend on such arguments. If the arguments don't work, then of course it doesn't have these consequences.
Now, please tell us something about your way of life. Do you live a philosophical life?
Yes, I suppose I do. I have worked at philosophy. I have thought it immensely important, immensely enjoyable too, for many decades. And yes, I continue to lead a 35-hour a week study of writing about, lecturing about philosophy, yes.